Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you for talking to BBC Arabic today.
Pleased to be with you.
You are going to give a lecture this evening in the context of the Edward Said London lecture organized by the Mosaic Rooms.
Yeah.
Now, my first question is not related to the lecture itself, because I'll be doing a separate report about it, but about something common I can see in you and Edward Said. Both of you have contributed a lot to humanity through your scientific achievements, but you still thought that you need to be engaged in political activism as well. Why is that?
Well, we were, of course, old friends for many years and engaged in many of the same activities on the same platforms many times. Why? Because apart from being a scholar and a scientist or a carpenter or a truck driver or whatever it may be, one is also a human being. And human beings have certain responsibilities. In fact, your responsibilities are greater to the extent that you have more privilege, as he and I did. If you're a university professor, you have quite a lot of privilege in many respects. And privilege just confers responsibility, yields opportunity, and then comes the question how you make use of it.
Now, and we're approaching the 10th anniversary of the Iraq War. Now, has the American administration started to review or reassess the war? I mean, study the consequences of the war on the United States, Iraq, the whole world. Has this process started, or are they still thinking that it was?
In a very narrow sense, actually, there was. So, for example, the question of the costs to the United States are considered and discussed. The questions whether it was a wise effort or a mistake, that's discussed. But what's never discussed is whether it was wrong. So, for example, when we discuss the Russian invasion of Hungary in 1956, or the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, or the German invasion of Poland in 1939, we don't ask what did it cost too much, should Hitler have destroyed England before he started a two-front war, was that a tactical error? Those aren't the questions we ask. We ask the kinds of questions that were raised at the Nuremberg Tribunal, which, after all, determined that aggression is the supreme international crime, which differs from other war crimes in that it encompasses all of the evil that follows. Well, you know, the Bush-Blair invasion of Iraq was about as clear a case of aggression as you can imagine. It's a textbook case. So therefore it encompasses all the evil that follows, including hundreds of thousands of corpses, millions of refugees, destruction of what had been the best educational system in the region, inciting a Sunni-Shia conflict, which is now engulfing the whole region in flames. All of these are part of the evil that accrues to the account of the aggressors. But those questions aren't raised. We only raise questions like that about others.
Well, in terms of the goals that they set for themselves, because, you know, they were after achieving democracy, bringing democracy to Iraq. I mean, this is what they announced.
Look, I mean, Stalin said that he was in favor of bringing democracy too. One thing that you don't do ever is pay attention to the pronouncements of leaders.
But in their own rhetoric, what are they saying now?
But what does everyone say? Stalin was going to defend, protect democracy from the fascists. Japanese fascism, when it invaded China, was going to bring an earthly paradise to the poor people of China. When Hitler took over the Sudetenland, later Czechoslovakia, it was for the most noble goals. He was going to end ethnic cleansing, bring the populations under the protection of the superior German culture, which could uplift them, and so on. I mean, if we had records from Genghis Khan, he was probably professing noble goals. So one thing that you don't do is listen to the rhetoric of leaders, because they carry no information. In a technical sense, they're predictable. So they carry no information.
People do listen to them, don't they? I mean, the American people does listen to what the leaders are saying.
American intellectuals do, and people less so. And one of the roles of the intellectual classes is to overlook this truism and to pretend that the pronouncements of our leaders, not of course other leaders, are very significant and have to be taken seriously. That's one of the roles of intellectuals. But among the population, much less so. Actually, there is interesting scholarly work on what's called democracy promotion, which is now traced to Reagan mostly. The best work on it is done by a man named Thomas Carruthers, who's a neo-Reaganite. He's not critical. He was in Reagan's State Department working on democracy promotion. He wrote several books about it. He's the director of the Law and Democracy Project of the Carnegie Foundation, so on, recognized scholar. And the results of his studies are exactly what any sane person would have anticipated. He does believe that it was sincere. He says sincere but a failure, and a very systematic failure. He says U.S. leaders are schizophrenic, a kind of psychiatric disorder. They pursue democracy if and only if it conforms to strategic and economic objectives. Otherwise they don't. And then he goes through cases, including in the Arab world. But could you expect anything else? I mean, what's interesting is that the intellectual culture actually takes this far seriously.
Yeah, and while we are at democracy, you were denied entry into the West Bank some time ago by Israel, right? Which is perceived by the West as a democracy. And
well,
actually,
the reasons are interesting, which aren't too well
known.
Yeah,
what threat do you
Well,
pose
the reasons
to their
were very
democracy?
interesting. I mean, I was with my daughter. We were interrogated at the border of the Allenby Bridge for several hours. Later, when it became an unpleasant incident, the Israeli government claimed that there was just an error by a border. It was not at all.
It means you can go now if you wish?
No, see what he was talking to the Ministry of Interior the whole time. He was just relaying questions from them. They did not deny me entry. What they wanted to know is why I am not going to Israel. If I was going to Israel and then was going to West Birzeit, the college, which was my goal, that would have been fine. In fact, I'd done it before. But what they didn't like was the fact that Birzeit, which is supposed to be under the Palestinian Authority, was inviting lecturers on their own without going through Israeli authority. It's much more interesting than denying me entry.
Yeah.
So if I said, okay, I'll go to Israel, then it would have been fine.
Yeah.
And then we could go to the West Bank.
Yeah. Having lived through the Israeli-Palestinian conflict myself, I've observed very closely how linguistic tools were employed to achieve political ends. So do you think that the conflict is in part a linguistic conflict used by both sides?
Every conflict is. Like the talk about democracy, but take this conflict. The territories that Israel conquered are called by the world occupied territories. Security Council has made it very clear that all the settlements are illegal. International Court of Justice, the same. The U.S. government, until 1982, called them occupied territories and called the settlements illegal. In 1982, there was a linguistic change. It was apparently introduced by this is the Reagan administration, by Eugene Rostow, who was a law professor at Yale, very pro-Israel. He recommended that they call them disputed territories and call the settlements not illegal, but an obstacle to peace. So if you look at U.S. government rhetoric from early Reagan years, I think it's 1982, until the present, it's not illegal and they're not occupied territories. It's maybe administered territories or disputed territories, and the settlements are an obstacle to peace, but not illegal. Contrary to what every relevant legal authority has stated, including, incidentally, the legal authorities of the government of Israel, who recognized back in 1967 and said so, that including the Attorney General, their leading legal advisor, that any settlements will be in violation of fundamental international law. But the words change as the goals and policies change. That's pretty normal.
I have a question about Hugo Chavez, and with whom you had a friendly relationship at the beginning. Then you were critical on some human rights issue. What is it that bothers the United States about him? He doesn't have any nuclear program. He's not known for his anti-Semitism. He's not accused of terrorism. What's wrong with him from the United States point of view?
He's independent. I mean, it's very clear, you know. If you are independent, you don't follow orders, you pursue your own path, you're in danger. That's the whole history of the Cold War. Take, say, Cuba. In the case of Chavez, it's recent, so we don't have internal documents from the government. But in the case of Cuba, Castro, it's half a century, so we have plenty of internal documents, and we know exactly the source of the hostility. I can quote it for you. The Latin American advisor of President Kennedy, historian Arthur Schlesinger, well-known liberal historian, he led Kennedy's task force for Cuba when Kennedy came in for Latin America. And he said the problem with Cuba is the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which will be appealing to others in the region where people are suffering from the same kinds of repression as they were in Cuba, and that's dangerous. Later, the State Department added that the problem is Cuba's successful defiance of U.S. policies, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. No Russians, just the U.S. is supposed to run this hemisphere, not people aren't supposed to defy it. That's very common. It's presented to the public as defense against Russian aggression or something. But as usual, you don't pay attention to the pretenses of political figures and the intellectuals who speak for them. You look at the internal record, at the facts, and you see it very clearly. You cannot permit independence. It's dangerous. It'll spread. Same kind of reason why the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia. I mean, Czechoslovakia wasn't going to invade Russia. They didn't have nuclear weapons, but if they moved towards independence, the whole system might begin to erode. And the same is true of the global system that the United States dominates. The invasion of Vietnam was about the same, if you look back. They were afraid that successful independent development would spread through the region and incite other similar movements. Pretty soon, as Henry Kissinger put it, the virus will infect the region. If the virus is successful independent development, it'll infect others.
Yeah. Now let's go back to the Arab world and talk a little bit about the Arab Spring, or what many enthusiasts at the beginning used to term it as the Arab Spring. Many of them have changed their mind when some revolutions started to change course, and things haven't been going the same way in all countries. What's your position on this?
I think it's mixed results so far, and it's kind of a work in progress. Egypt things are going to continue. Tunisia, things will continue, but I think it's of historic importance, even what's been achieved so far. So, for example, take Egypt. Egypt, with most major country, there have been some achievements which I think are lasting. There's far greater freedom of speech, freedom of press, labor activism, which is a major factor in Egypt. Has a long militant labor movement, same in Tunisia. Now, organizing is much freer from violent repression. The beginnings of establishment of significant independent unions. A lot of the strife around Port Said and so on the last couple of weeks, a lot of it has been labor action in Mahala and elsewhere. That's all new, and that's important. On the other hand, the effort to restore effectively the old regime under different names, that's proceeding too. And if you, in other parts of the Arab world, the MENA world, Middle East, North Africa, in the parts that are most important for the West, which are the oil dictatorships, there everything's been repressed, sometimes pretty violently. And that's a relief to the Western powers, to the United States and Britain. They want the old regime established. The last thing they want is democracy. Of course, they talk about democracy, but that's normal. So from the Western point of view, say U.S.-British point of view, or in the Maghreb, the French point of view, it's fairly successful. They've kept the dictatorships where they want them, and they've managed to restore something like the old regime, not exactly, in the countries of most significance to them. Remember that France in Tunisia and United States in Egypt supported the dictators as long as it was possible. It became impossible. Well, there's a standard procedure. If you can't support your favorite dictator any longer because maybe the army's turned against him, there's a standard procedure. Send him off somewhere, to Sharm el-Sheikh or wherever it is, and then try to restore the old order. And that's pretty much what's happening.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
You support your own interests, and nothing else matters.
Yeah.
And of course, it's the job of intellectuals to make it look like a paradox or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's all pretty straightforward.
Yeah, actually, I've been reading your interview book, Power Systems, in which you quote Adam Smith saying that those who own society are the ones who rule. Yeah. But aren't they doing that with the authorization of those who don't own anything through elections, through?
Well, they manage to ensure that elections don't do anything. So in the United States, for example, which is it's called a democratic society, the big domestic issue right now, huge domestic issue, is the deficit. Yeah. That's why there's a sequester in countries. As far as the public's concerned, the deficit is not a problem.
Yeah.
For the public, the problem is jobs.
Yeah.
But for the banks and for the wealthy, the problem is the deficit. So therefore, the only thing that's discussed is the deficit.
Yeah.
The media only discuss the deficit.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look closely, and it has been studied closely, the bottom roughly 70% of the population, in terms of income level, have no influence whatsoever on policy.
Yeah.
They're completely disenfranchised. Yeah. So is that democracy?
Yeah.
Kind of democracy. Same in England. England isn't studied as closely as the United States is. It should be, but it isn't. But I'll bet you if there were serious polls taken here, Cameron's economic policies, Osborne's economic policies would be not what the public would want.
Can I just get you to do the handshake again?
Yeah, so the handshake.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And we want some photographs as well.
Okay.